The locker door hadn't opened in 3 days. Someone had driven a support pin into the seam and welded it flush with a field torch, and when questioned, the maintenance log had recorded no repairs, no requests, no names. Mira Callahan stopped asking. She set her boot against the bulkhead, gripped the handle, and hauled until the weld screeched and let go all at once, throwing her back a step. Her knuckles split against the metal edge. She flexed her hand once, checked it wasn't broken, and moved on. The habitat ring had a particular quality of quiet reserved for her. Cadets from 6 worlds drifted through the corridors in the low gravity of the outer band, all of them thin-boned, careful, built by evolutionary histories that had never required brute endurance. They didn't jeer when she passed. They simply widened their paths, the way you'd step around standing water you didn't trust the depth of. It wasn't hatred. It was closer to a held breath, the polite unease of people who had been told, in low voices and old records, that her planet was a place you survived rather than lived on, and who had never quite decided whether that made her admirable or simply strange. She pulled her jacket from the locker, checked the seams for damage from the pin, and walked to the simulation bay without hurrying. The bay smelled of recycled air and the metallic sweetness of the coolant lines threading the walls. Instructor Vol stood at the head of the room, upper arms folded across a narrow chest, lower arms clasped behind in the posture that meant the lecture had teeth. Around him, the cadets arranged themselves in loose rows, quiet in the particular way that meant the subject mattered. "Deathworld protocol," Vol said, and the room's posture changed before he'd finished the phrase. Spines straightened. A crest flattened somewhere in the second row, an involuntary tell of discomfort. Formal classification for a world whose gravity, atmosphere, pathogen load, or native life renders it hostile to unshielded sapient presence without extensive preparation. You will treat this drill as though your life depends on your discipline, because on the world in question, it would. A cadet near the front turned in his seat. Threll, pale and long-necked, moved with the unhurried elegance of a species built for gentler gravity, and his mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile when his gaze found Mira at the back of the room. Should the local expert demonstrate first, save the rest of us the embarrassment? The laughter that followed wasn't vicious. It was the easy, thoughtless kind that comes when a room has already decided who the joke belongs to and stopped checking whether it was still funny. A few cadets didn't laugh, most did. Mira stood. She didn't answer him. She walked to the start marker, and when the suit technician reached out with the pressure gear, she looked at it for a moment, the way you'd look at a coat offered on a day you already knew wasn't cold, and shook her head. "Suit is mandatory for the exercise," Vol said, not unkindly, more out of procedure than conviction. "Not where I grew up," Mira said, and stepped past him onto the course. She went through it clean, vaulted the collapsed bulkhead mock-up without breaking stride, hauled the 200-kilo evacuation dummy through the flooded corridor section in a fraction of the time the fastest-suited cadet had managed all week, sealed the simulated hull breach with her palms flat against the panel before the decompression alarm had finished its first full cycle. She didn't look strained. She looked like someone doing something ordinary, the way another person might carry groceries up a flight of stairs. Nobody clapped when she finished, but the laughter had gone out of the room somewhere around the third obstacle, and Threll's mouth had closed and stayed closed, which was, in its own way, louder than applause. The real alarm came 11 minutes later. It wasn't the drill klaxon. This tone sat lower in the chest, wrong in a way that some old animal part of the brain recognized before conscious thought caught up. The overhead lights flickered twice and failed. Emergency strips bled red along the floor seams, throwing everyone's shadow long and strange across the deck. Somewhere below the bay, metal shrieked, not the groan of thermal stress, but something torn. In the sudden dark, most of the room froze. Bodies built for calm environments, for stable pressure and predictable weather, met the one variable they had never been asked to plan for and simply stopped, caught between instructions that no longer applied. Mira was already moving. She counted the paces to the exit from memory. 6, then a turn, then 4 more. Because she had learned a long time ago that light was a convenience the universe was under no obligation to provide. Nobody followed her because they trusted her yet. They followed because, in the dark, she was the only voice in the room that didn't shake. The corridor beyond the bay had buckled inward along one wall, a support strut driven through the panel like a spear. Atmosphere hissed from a hairline seam nearby, a thin, hungry sound that promised to get worse. Threll came up close behind her, breathing too fast, flinching each time the hull groaned around them. "This way," Mira said, and didn't wait to see whether he'd follow. He followed. 2 more cadets fell in behind him, a stocky, quiet one named Ors, and a smaller cadet whose name Mira hadn't caught yet and wouldn't ask for now, because names cost attention she needed elsewhere. She led them by feel, one palm dragging along the wall, fingers reading the seams between panels like a blind woman reading a familiar room. "You're not using your scanner," Threll said, his voice thin with the effort of sounding steady. "Scanners lie when the air's full of particulate," she said. "Hands don't lie. Hands just hurt." "That is," he said after a pause, "a genuinely unsettling piece of wisdom." "It's a coping mechanism," she said, and kept moving. They found a maintenance technician midway around the ring, pinned beneath a fallen support brace, one leg bent at an angle that made Ors turn his head away. The tech had stopped screaming somewhere in the last few minutes and had settled into the worst sound, the short, controlled gasp of someone conserving what little breath they had left to conserve. Mira knelt without hesitation. "Hold his shoulders," she told Threll. "Don't let him watch his own leg." She assessed the fracture with 2 fingers, testing pressure points with a clinical detachment that seemed to unsettle Threll more than the injury itself. Then she snapped the already cracked support strut at its weak point, laid it alongside the brake, and tore a long strip from her own jacket sleeve to bind it tight. The tech's breathing hitched once, then began to even, not because the pain had eased, but because someone competent had put hands on him like his survival was a foregone conclusion rather than a question. Threll stared at the finished splint the way you'd stare at something that had rearranged a fact you'd been sure of your whole life. "You built a medical device," he said slowly, "out of structural debris and your own clothing." "Where I'm from," Mira said, tying off the last knot, "garbage is just supplies that haven't been used yet." She wasn't smiling when she said it. It wasn't a line built for effect. But something clicked in Threll's throat, an involuntary, disbelieving sound that in a species with different anatomy might have been the first note of a laugh. The moment didn't last. Farther down the ring, past the amber flicker of an emergency light struggling to hold its charge, something moved that was not settling debris and was not the pressure differential of a hull breach. Something with weight behind its motion. Something with intent. Mira went still, and the stillness itself told the others more than words could have. The exhausted calm that had carried her through the last 20 minutes sharpened into something colder, older, more focused. "That's not structural failure," she said, quiet enough that Threll had to lean in to catch it. "Then what is it?" She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice had dropped into a register none of them had heard from her before. Flat, unhurried, the voice of someone running very fast arithmetic with very little time to check the work. "Something's loose, something that shouldn't exist on a station rated for a crew like this." She looked at Threll, and for the first time since the alarm sounded, he saw past the calm to the exhaustion underneath it, the particular tiredness of someone who had run this equation before and never once liked the answer. "Get him to the shelter pod. All of you. Now." He wouldn't go. He planted himself in the hatchway with a stubbornness that would have been admirable under different circumstances and was, under these, simply going to get him killed. "I'm not leaving you to face whatever that is alone." "You're not leaving me anything," Mira said, already turning back toward the corridor. You're accepting a decision I already made on your behalf. She pushed him through the hatch before he could argue further and sealed it from her side, and the last image he had of her before the metal closed was not fear. It was focus. The particular terrible clarity of someone whose childhood had taught her, without patience and without apology, exactly how to meet the thing that wanted to kill her. What came down the corridor toward her defied clean description, the kind of shape the station's biological archive would have filed under provisional and moved on from. Too many limbs, moving in a rhythm suited to a gravity well far crueler than the ring's simulated pull. Segmented along a spine that flexed wrong, patient in the unhurried way of something that had never once lost and had stopped needing to hurry because of it. The fight that followed had no cinema in it, no clean choreography, no music swelling underneath. It was short, and it was ugly, and it took things from her, a gash along her forearm deep enough to show bone white before the blood welled up, a rib that would ache for a month after. One long moment near the end when the creature had her pinned to the deck and she felt, with total and almost peaceful clarity, the exact shape of her own death arrive at the door and, just as clearly, decide to wait a little longer. She didn't win because she was stronger. She won because she had spent a childhood learning the give in things that wanted her dead, storms that arrived without warning on a coastline that punished anyone who forgot to watch the sky, ground that opened without asking permission, animals that hunted with a patience no simulation module could ever fully replicate. She had learned, over and over, through 100 smaller lessons, exactly how much a thing could take before it broke. It broke. She came back through the reopened hatch on her own feet, but barely. One hand pressed hard against her side, a thin line of blood tracking down her jaw from a cut she didn't remember taking. There was no triumph on her face. Only the look of someone who had spent something valuable and hadn't yet totaled what it cost. Threll caught her before her knees gave, his forearms steadier and stronger than his slight frame suggested. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. He was looking at her the way you look at something you thought you understood, and suddenly, all at once, do not. Deathworld, he said eventually, testing the word like it had changed weight in his mouth. We were taught it as a caution, a place too hostile to be safely inhabited. Mira closed her eyes against the ache spreading through her side. It's not a caution, she said. It's a description. It just never stopped teaching us how to live with it. She didn't say it like tragedy. She said it the way you'd describe weather you'd long since made peace with, a fact of the world, neither complaint nor boast. Repair crews worked the ring for the better part of 2 days after that, patching hull seams, swapping burned conduit runs, sweeping debris into bins with the brisk, unsentimental rhythm of people who preferred not to dwell on why the work was necessary. The rest of the station eased back into its ordinary shape. Drills resumed on their old schedule, the mess hall filled again at its usual hours, and the particular gossip that follows any near disaster made its rounds and slowly wore itself thin. The cadets who had once crossed corridors to avoid Mira now kept a different distance from her. Closer, uncertain, unsure how to close the last stretch of ground between politeness and something more honest. Nobody organized an apology. Nobody gave a speech. It simply became easier, over those 2 days, for someone to sit near her at meals or fall into step beside her without an excuse ready in case she asked why. Threll found her at the observation deck on the second evening, his arm still bound in a support wrap, standing at the long viewport where the black pressed close and unbroken except for the scattered burn of distant systems. He stood beside her a while before speaking, because it turned out that was one more thing he'd picked up from her, that silence didn't need filling to carry weight. I owe you an accounting, he said finally, for the locker, for the laughter in the simulation bay, for assuming the loudest rumor about your world was the only true thing about it. You don't owe me an accounting, Mira said, not looking away from the window. You owe yourself a better habit of assuming, next time. He considered that for a moment, and something shifted along his crest. Not quite a smile, but a near relation of one. Is it accurate, then, that all humans carry themselves the way you do? She almost laughed, and the sound surprised her enough that she let it come. Small, real. The first one she'd allowed herself since the alarm had first sounded 2 days before. No, she said. Most of us are worse. We're just quieter about it. Threll didn't fully grasp the humor in that, and it didn't matter. He understood enough of it. That the laugh, however brief, was something given rather than owed, and that she hadn't needed to give it. He left her to the window not long after, and she stayed there for a long while on her own, watching a small blue-white light hold steady against the dark, unremarkable to look at, entirely indifferent to whatever reputation it had earned among the systems that feared it. She felt no pride looking at it. Pride wasn't the shape of what settled in her chest. It was something closer to understanding. Tired, complete, carrying no anger in it at all, for why the world she'd come from had never once, in all its long and difficult history, had the luxury of raising anything soft.